The spring of 1945 brought an end to the most devastating conflict humanity had ever witnessed. As Allied forces pushed deeper into German territory, they encountered scenes of unprecedented destruction, cities reduced to rubble, industries shattered, and a population teetering on the edge of collapse. Among the ruins walked the remnants of the once mighty Wehrmacht, soldiers who had fought across continents, now reduced to hollow-eyed shadows of their former selves. When British units began accepting mass surrenders in April and May of that year, they faced an unexpected humanitarian challenge. The prisoners who shuffled into Allied custody weren't the propaganda images of fierce warriors. They were starving men, many weighing barely 90 pounds, their uniforms hanging loose on skeletal frames. Years of total war had drained Germany's resources to nothing. Rations had become scarce, then pitiful, then almost non-existent. What happened next would challenge both sides' preconceptions about their enemies. British soldiers, themselves veterans of years of rationing and hardship, looked at these defeated men and saw not monsters, but human beings in desperate need. The decision to share food would spark reactions of disbelief, gratitude, and a complex reckoning with the nature of warfare itself. Lieutenant James Morrison of the Royal Artillery had seen his share of combat since landing in Normandy 11 months earlier. He'd witnessed the liberation of towns, the bitter fighting through the Ardennes, and the final push across the Rhine. But nothing prepared him for the scene at the makeshift prisoner collection point near Lüneburg in early May 1945. Thousands of German soldiers had surrendered as their units disintegrated. They arrived in columns, many without weapons, their hands raised more from exhaustion than compliance. Morrison noticed immediately how thin they were. His own rations had been modest throughout the war. Britain itself had endured years of strict rationing, but these men looked like they hadn't eaten properly in months. "Get the field kitchens up here," Morrison ordered his sergeant, "and break out the emergency rations." Sergeant William Davies hesitated. "Sir, those are for our lads if we get cut off." "Look at them, Sergeant. When did you last see prisoners this badly off?" The German prisoners stood in organized lines, military discipline ingrained despite their condition. Among them was Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, a 23-year-old infantryman from Bavaria who had fought since 1942. He'd survived the Eastern Front, where cold and hunger had been as deadly as Soviet bullets. He'd survived the Western Front's artillery barrages and air raids. Now in defeat, he expected the worst. Weber had heard stories, all soldiers had, about what happened to prisoners. The propaganda had painted the Allies as vengeful, brutal. He'd seen what happened to Soviet prisoners in German hands and assumed reciprocity was inevitable. As British soldiers approached with large metal containers, Weber braced himself. "Form up in lines of 50, a British corporal shouted in accented German. "You'll be fed and processed." "Fed?" Weber glanced at his comrades. Several looked equally confused. They'd been on quarter rations for weeks, then eighth rations, then whatever they could scavenge. The smell coming from those containers made Weber's stomach clench painfully. It smelled like actual food, hot, real food. The first prisoners reached the serving line. British soldiers ladled thick stew into metal bowls, added chunks of bread, and handed them out. Weber watched as a German private took his bowl with shaking hands, stared at it for a long moment, then began to weep. The British soldiers manning the field kitchens worked with mechanical efficiency, but even they seemed affected by the prisoners' reactions. Private Thomas Atkins, a cook from Manchester, had been serving meals to troops for 3 years. He'd never seen men react to food like this. "Easy there, mate," Atkins said, as one prisoner tried to gulp down his stew too fast. "Slow down or you'll make yourself sick." The warning proved prescient. Within an hour, several prisoners were vomiting, their shrunken stomachs unable to handle the sudden influx of rich food. The British medical officer, Captain David Reynolds, quickly intervened. "Smaller portions," Reynolds ordered. "Their systems can't process this much at once. We need to reintroduce food gradually." Reynolds had studied medicine at Cambridge before the war, but nothing in his training had prepared him for treating starvation on this scale. He moved among the prisoners, checking pulses, examining eyes, assessing the extent of malnutrition. Many showed signs of edema, swelling from protein deficiency. Others had lesions in their mouths from vitamin deficiencies. "How long have you been on reduced rations?" Reynolds asked Weber in careful German. "Since February, properly reduced, sir," Weber replied, using the honorific automatically. "Before that, gradually worsening since last autumn." And before the war? Were you healthy? Weber almost laughed. I weighed 75 kilograms when I was conscripted. Perhaps 50 now. Reynolds did the conversion in his head. Weber had lost over 50 pounds. Looking around the camp, he realized this was typical, not exceptional. Lieutenant Morrison joined Reynolds as he completed his initial assessments. What's the verdict, Doctor? We've got several hundred men here in varying stages of malnutrition. Some are in immediate danger. Their bodies are consuming their own organs for energy. We need to feed them carefully, gradually increase portions over days or weeks. Morrison nodded grimly. I've sent word up the chain. We're going to need more medical supplies and food. How many do you think we'll be receiving? In this sector alone, based on the surrender rates I'm hearing about, tens of thousands, possibly more. Both men looked out at the growing mass of prisoners, each one a logistical challenge and a humanitarian obligation. By evening, the news had spread through the prisoner camp with remarkable speed. The British were feeding them real food, not the sawdust-mixed bread or watery soup that had sustained them for months. More surprising still, they were being treated with a measure of dignity that contradicted everything they'd been told. Feldwebel Ernst Hartmann, a veteran sergeant who had commanded a machine gun section, found himself grappling with cognitive dissonance. At 35, he was older than most of the prisoners, old enough to remember the previous war and the bitter aftermath of Versailles. He'd believed the ideology that painted the British as vindictive enemies who would show no mercy. They gave me seconds, a young private told Hartmann, his voice filled with wonder. I asked for more bread, and the English soldier just gave it to me, smiled even. Hartmann had seen the pattern throughout the day. The British soldiers weren't friendly exactly. There was still the barrier of recent combat between them, but they weren't cruel either. They were professional, efficient, and surprisingly generous with their resources. That night, as prisoners settled into designated areas of the camp, conversations buzzed with speculation. Some remained suspicious, suggesting this was temporary, that harsher treatment would come once they were transferred to permanent camps. Others, like Weber, felt something shift in their understanding of the conflict. We were told they would starve us in revenge, Weber said quietly to Hartmann. We were told many things. Hartmann grunted non-committally. He'd been a soldier long enough to know that propaganda served its purpose during war, but the evidence before him was undeniable. Despite their own supply challenges, he'd seen British soldiers eating similar rations to what the prisoners received. They were sharing. The revelation carried weight beyond mere survival. For many of these German soldiers, years of indoctrination had painted their enemies as fundamentally barbaric. Yet here were British soldiers, themselves lean from years of rationing, giving food to men who had been trying to kill them weeks earlier. Perhaps, Weber continued, we were wrong about more than just the meals. Hartmann didn't respond, but the thought lingered. If they had been wrong about this, what else had they been wrong about? The question was uncomfortable, even dangerous to contemplate, but it persisted nonetheless. Lieutenant Morrison spent the night in his command tent, wrestling with reports and requisition forms. The prisoner situation was growing beyond anyone's initial estimates. What had started as a few hundred captives in his sector had swelled to over 3,000 by nightfall, and intelligence suggested thousands more were surrendering throughout the British occupation zone. Sir, we've got a problem, Sergeant Davies announced, entering with a sheaf of papers. The supply depot is balking at our food requisitions. They're saying we're using 3 times our allocated rations. Because we're feeding 3 times as many people as planned, Morrison replied sharply. What do they expect us to do, let them starve? There's also been grumbling among some of the lads. They're asking why we're being so generous to prisoners when their own families back home are still on rations. Morrison set down his pen and rubbed his tired eyes. It was a fair question, one without an easy answer. British civilians had endured years of deprivation. Meat, butter, sugar, eggs, all strictly rationed. His own mother's letters described making meals from vegetables and hope, and here he was, ordering his men to share scarce resources with defeated enemies. Gather the men tomorrow morning, Morrison said finally. I'll address it then. The next dawn brought gray skies and drizzle. Morrison stood before his assembled company, looking at faces he'd known for months or years. These were good men who'd fought hard and lost friends. They deserved an explanation. I know some of you are questioning why we're feeding the prisoners so well, Morrison began. It's a fair concern. Your families are rationed back home. You've all gone hungry at times during this campaign, so why should we care about them? He paused, letting the question hang. Because that's what separates us from what we've been fighting against. We didn't fight this war to become like our enemies. We fought it to preserve the idea that human beings deserve basic dignity, even in defeat. Especially in defeat. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably, but Morrison noticed others nodding slightly. These men are prisoners now, not soldiers. They're our responsibility, and how we treat them says everything about who we are and what we've been fighting for. We'll continue to feed them properly. Any questions? The silence that followed was answer enough. Among the German prisoners, a different kind of tension was building. Not all reactions to British generosity were positive. In one section of the camp, Hauptmann Otto Steiner, a former company commander, watched the proceedings with growing unease. Steiner represented a harder breed of officer, ideologically committed, unrepentant. He'd fought on 3 fronts and still believed in the cause despite its collapse. To him, the British kindness wasn't humanity. It was weakness, and more dangerously, it was working. They're trying to break us psychologically, Steiner told a group of NCOs who still looked to him for leadership, making us grateful, dependent. It's sophisticated psychological warfare. But even as he spoke, Steiner could see his words finding less purchase than they would have weeks ago. Men who had been fed, whose immediate suffering had been alleviated, were less receptive to ideology. Full stomachs made poor fuel for fanaticism. Weber, overhearing Steiner's conversation, felt anger rise. With respect, Herr Hauptmann, the British could have marched us into barbed wire enclosures and left us to rot. Many of us would be dead by now. Instead, they're treating us like human beings. They're treating us like defeated animals, Steiner shot back, making us docile for whatever comes next. The confrontation attracted attention. Other prisoners formed a loose circle around the 2 men. Hartmann, sensing potential trouble, intervened. Enough, the old sergeant said firmly. Hauptmann, we're prisoners now. The war is over. These philosophical debates serve no purpose except to divide us when we need to stay together. Steiner's jaw tightened, but he fell silent. The shift in power dynamics was obvious. Rank mattered less when the institution it represented had ceased to exist. The authority structure of the German military was dissolving, replaced by something more fundamental, survival, and the basic human need to make sense of unexpected kindness. Later that day, Captain Reynolds noticed the tension during his medical rounds. What was that about? He asked Morrison, who'd observed the incident. Internal politics, Morrison replied. Some of the hardliners are trying to maintain ideological control, but it's a losing battle. Hard to maintain hatred towards someone who's feeding you. Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Maslow's hierarchy. Meet their basic needs, and suddenly the propaganda loses its power. Psychology, Doctor? Human nature, Lieutenant. Just human nature. As days passed, the dynamic in the prisoner camp continued to evolve. British soldiers and German prisoners developed an unspoken protocol. Not friendship exactly, but a working relationship based on mutual respect for shared humanity. Small gestures accumulated. A British soldier helping an elderly German prisoner carry his belongings. A German medic assisting the British medical staff with translations and triage. Weber found himself assigned to the camp kitchen detail, helping distribute food alongside British personnel. It was surreal, working beside men who had been enemies days ago. Private Atkins, the Manchester cook, taught him the English names for kitchen implements, while Weber helped improve the German phrasebook the British used for camp management. "Your English is excellent," Atkins commented one morning as they prepared breakfast portions. "My mother was a school teacher," Weber replied. "She insisted I learn languages, said the world was bigger than Germany." He paused, the memory painful now. "I don't know if she survived the bombing." Atkins was quiet for a moment. "My sister's husband was killed at Arnhem. German artillery." The 2 men looked at each other, the weight of their nation's collision compressed into this single moment. Then Atkins extended his hand. Thomas Atkins. Weber shook it. Klaus Weber. It wasn't forgiveness. Neither man could offer that on behalf of their countries or their dead. But it was acknowledgement, recognition that both had been swept up in forces larger than themselves. Captain Reynolds documented these interactions in his reports. He noted improved morale among prisoners, faster recovery from malnutrition, and decreasing incidents of conflict. The psychological impact of adequate food and humane treatment was proving as significant as the physical benefits. Lieutenant Morrison read Reynolds's reports with mixed feelings. The humanitarian success was undeniable, but he couldn't shake the awareness of the larger picture. Britain was exhausted, financially drained, its cities bombed, its people weary. The resources being spent on prisoners were desperately needed elsewhere. Yet every time he doubted the policy, he walked through the camp and saw the results. Men who had arrived as hollow-eyed wraiths were beginning to look human again. Some even smiled occasionally. And his own soldiers, he noticed, seemed to carry themselves differently, proud of being victors who could afford mercy rather than requiring revenge. The war had brutalized everyone involved. Perhaps this small pocket of decency was a reminder of what they'd been fighting to preserve. The prisoner population swelled to over 15,000 in the British sector by mid-May. The logistics became increasingly complex. Morrison's unit had been reinforced with additional support staff, but the challenges multiplied daily. The carefully managed feeding program Reynolds had designed required constant monitoring. Too much food too fast could kill men whose bodies had adapted to starvation. "We're seeing refeeding syndrome in about 12% of new arrivals," Reynolds reported during a command meeting. "Their bodies can't handle normal nutrition suddenly. We've lost 3 prisoners despite our precautions." The deaths hit the medical staff hard. They'd worked tirelessly to save lives, only to have success snatched away by the complex biochemistry of starvation recovery. Reynolds began insisting on even more gradual reintroduction of food, which meant longer periods before prisoners could work or be transported to permanent camps. Meanwhile, the political situation was shifting. The alliance between Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, held together by common enemies, was beginning to show cracks. German prisoners were becoming a political asset, potential labor forces for reconstruction, or in some calculations, possible allies against a new rival. Morrison received a visit from a Colonel Richards, a staff officer from divisional headquarters. Richards walked through the camp, observing the relatively content prisoners, the organized medical care, the functioning kitchen operations. "You've done impressive work here, Morrison," Richards said. "Very impressive indeed." "Thank you, sir. Dr. Reynolds deserves most of the credit." "Indeed. Which brings me to my purpose. We're documenting best practices for prisoner management. Your operation will be studied and replicated. The approach you've taken, treating them humanely, feeding them properly, is being recognized at the highest levels." Morrison felt both pride and unease. "Sir, we're just following basic protocols. The Geneva Conventions are one thing, Lieutenant. How they're implemented is another. Not all sectors have been as generous as yours." Richards's tone suggested he'd seen less admirable examples. That evening, Morrison discussed the visit with Reynolds and Davies over weak tea. "We're becoming a model," Morrison said. "Not sure how I feel about that." "Beats the alternative," Davies replied. Hearing stories from the American sectors, some of the early camps were disaster zones. And as for what the Soviets are doing with their prisoners, they all fell silent, contemplating the various fates of the defeated Wehrmacht across occupied Germany. As spring turned toward summer, the character of the camp continued to transform. With basic survival secured, prisoners began thinking about their futures. Where would they be sent? When could they go home? What would they find when they got there? Weber had received permission to write a letter home through the Red Cross, though he had no way of knowing if his family still existed to receive it. His hometown of Rosenheim had been bombed repeatedly. His father had been killed early in the war on the Eastern Front. His mother and 2 younger sisters had been living there when he last heard from them in March. The uncertainty gnawed at him, but it was balanced by an unexpected emotion: guilt. He was being fed, sheltered, treated decently, while his family, if they survived, were likely struggling with even worse conditions than the prisoners faced. The defeated German civilian population had been plunged into chaos, food supplies devastated, infrastructure destroyed. "You can't help them by suffering more yourself," Hartmann told him when Weber voiced these thoughts. The older sergeant had taken on an unofficial role as counselor to younger prisoners struggling with the psychological aftermath of defeat and captivity. "It doesn't feel right," Weber insisted. "The British are enemies, yet they treat us better than our own government did in the final months." "That says something about the British," Hartmann replied, "but it also says something about the leadership we followed." Such conversations were becoming more common. With the immediate threat of starvation removed, prisoners had mental space to process what had happened. Some, like Hauptmann Steiner, clung to ideology even in defeat. Others began questioning everything they'd believed. The British soldiers noticed the change too. Private Atkins mentioned to Morrison that Weber had asked him about British life, about what ordinary people in England believed about the war. "They're starting to see us as individuals," Atkins said, "not just the enemy. Makes you wonder how different things might have been if we'd all had these conversations before the shooting started." Morrison nodded, but kept his thoughts private. Before the shooting started, Weber would have been 16 years old. Atkins barely 20. They'd all been conscripted into a conflict they didn't create, shaped by forces beyond their control. The meals shared now couldn't undo the years of violence, but perhaps they could sketch the outline of something better. June brought administrative reorganization. The temporary camp was being converted into a semi-permanent facility, while longer-term plans were developed for the prisoner population. Some would be retained as labor for reconstruction efforts. Others would eventually be repatriated, as Germany was rebuilt under Allied occupation. Morrison received orders transferring him to a new posting. After months running the prisoner operation, he was being rotated to administrative duty in Hamburg. His replacement, a Captain Thompson from Yorkshire, arrived with a reputation as an efficient administrator, but with no direct experience managing prisoners. "The key is consistency," Morrison told Thompson during the handover briefing. "They're malnourished, traumatized, and uncertain about their futures. Maintaining routine, especially around meals, gives them stability." Thompson nodded, taking notes. "And the feeding protocol Dr. Reynolds established? Critical. Don't let anyone shortcut it. I know there's pressure to reduce costs, but these men's lives depend on gradual nutritional restoration." On his final day, Morrison walked through the camp one last time. He was surprised by how much he'd become invested in these men's welfare. They were still the enemy in the abstract, but individually they'd become human beings with names, stories, and hopes for survival. Weber approached him near the kitchen area. "Lieutenant Morrison, sir. I heard you're leaving. Orders, I'm afraid. Captain Thompson will take over. He's a good officer. I wanted to thank you, sir, for everything. Many of us wouldn't have survived without—" Weber struggled for the right words in English. "Without your decency." Morrison felt unexpectedly moved. "You're welcome, Weber. I hope you find your family well when you eventually return home." They shook hands, captor and captive, enemy soldiers who'd found common ground in the simple act of sharing food. That evening, as Morrison packed his personal effects, he reflected on the experience. The war had been filled with destruction, violence, and hatred. This small camp, with its policy of treating defeated enemies as human beings deserving dignity, felt like a tiny island of sanity in an ocean of madness. He'd joined the army to fight for Britain, to defend his country against aggression. He'd never imagined that one of his most important contributions would be ensuring that starving German soldiers received adequate portions of stew and bread. Yet somehow that felt more meaningful than many of the battles he'd fought. Under Captain Thompson's management, the camp continued functioning efficiently, though some prisoners noticed subtle changes in atmosphere. Thompson was professional, but more distant than Morrison had been. He saw the operation primarily through a logistical lens: inputs, outputs, efficiency metrics. "We're running 20% over budget on food allocation," Thompson announced at his first staff meeting. "That needs to be tightened." Dr. Reynolds immediately objected. "Sir, the feeding protocol is calibrated specifically to prevent refeeding syndrome and optimize recovery. Any reduction could have serious health consequences. I'm not suggesting we starve them, doctor, but surely there's room for economy. They're prisoners, not guests at a hotel." The tension was immediate. Reynolds, Atkins, and other staff who'd worked under Morrison felt something valuable was being lost. The approach that had made the camp a model was being reduced to mere numbers. Weber noticed it too. Portions were still adequate but calculated to the gram. The small extras that had occasionally appeared, an extra slice of bread, a bit more stew, vanished. More significantly, the informal interactions between British soldiers and German prisoners decreased. Thompson had instituted stricter protocols about fraternization. "It's more professional this way," Thompson explained to his officers. Morrison was too personally involved, created inappropriate relationships between captors and prisoners. Yet something had been lost, and everyone felt it. The camp became more efficient, but less human. Prisoners were processed rather than cared for. The subtle shift in language reflected the change in philosophy. Hartmann observed it all with the wisdom of his years. The young lieutenant understood something important. He told Weber, "He saw us as people first, prisoners second. This new captain sees only prisoners. The change crystallized when a prisoner became severely ill with pneumonia. Under Morrison's leadership, Dr. Reynolds would have immediately hospitalized him in the British medical facility. Thompson debated the resource allocation for hours before approving the transfer. The prisoner survived, but the incident highlighted the philosophical divide. Some British soldiers grumbled about Thompson's approach, but followed orders. Others, like Private Atkins, found small ways to maintain the humanity Morrison had established. An extra moment of conversation here, a small kindness there. The camp functioned, met its metrics, and processed thousands of prisoners efficiently, but the spirit that had made it exceptional had been diluted. Sometimes efficiency and humanity existed in tension, and Thompson had chosen efficiency. As summer progressed, the broader fate of Germany's defeated military became clearer. Millions of prisoners were scattered across Allied-controlled zones, each facing different conditions based on their captors' policies and resources. The contrast was stark. American camps, dealing with the largest prisoner populations, struggled with logistics. Some facilities became overcrowded disaster zones where men died from disease and continued malnutrition. Others, particularly later in the occupation, developed better systems inspired by British best practices. Soviet camps in the East presented the darkest fate. German prisoners there faced years of hard labor, harsh conditions, and high mortality. The brutality of the Eastern Front's fighting had left no room for the kind of humanity the British had shown in the West. Weber heard these reports through the camp grapevine. Stories from new arrivals transferred between zones. Rumors from Red Cross workers, fragments of news. He realized with profound gratitude how fortunate he'd been to surrender where and when he did. "We could have been marched east," one prisoner said during a meal. "The Soviets aren't feeding anyone. We could have been in an open-air American camp like Rhein-Wiesenlager," another added, referring to the notorious makeshift camps where early American prisoner operations had failed catastrophically. Even under Thompson's more austere management, the British camp remained far better than most alternatives. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The nation they'd been taught to see as a primary enemy had treated them better than they might have treated themselves in the war's final chaotic months. Dr. Reynolds continued documenting the medical recovery of prisoners under his care. His reports would later contribute to understanding refeeding syndrome and the proper treatment of starvation victims. The accidental medical research conducted in the camp would save lives far beyond its immediate population. Meanwhile, Britain itself struggled with post-war recovery. Rationing would continue for years. The economy was shattered, the empire was collapsing, and the country faced a long, difficult rebuilding process. Yet they had chosen, in this small corner of the occupation, to maintain their humanity even when it cost them resources they desperately needed. The meals shared between British soldiers and German prisoners in the spring and summer of 1945 were more than simple nutrition. They were a statement about the kind of peace that would follow the war. Imperfect, complicated, but grounded in the recognition of shared humanity. August brought news that would reshape everything. The war in the Pacific had ended with the use of devastating new weapons. The full scope of wartime atrocities was emerging as investigation teams entered camps across Europe. The Nuremberg trials were being organized. The world was beginning to reckon with what had been done, and by whom. For the German prisoners, this period brought a complex reckoning. Some, like Hauptmann Steiner, refused to believe initial reports of systematic atrocities. Others, including Weber and Hartmann, felt a crushing weight of collective guilt even if they personally had committed no crimes. "We served that system," Weber said during a conversation with Hartmann. "Even if we didn't know everything, we were part of it." "Knowing what to do with that truth is the challenge," Hartmann replied. "Some will deny it, some will be destroyed by it, some will try to build something better from the ruins." The British staff watched these psychological struggles with mixed feelings. Captain Reynolds increased his observation of prisoner mental health, concerned about potential suicides as the full picture emerged. Lieutenant Morrison's successor, Thompson, maintained his professional distance, but even he seemed affected by the moral complexity of the situation. Private Atkins continued his quiet friendship with Weber, though conversations became more difficult as the weight of recent history pressed down on them both. One evening, Weber asked him directly, "How can you still treat us decently, knowing what your investigators are finding?" Atkins was silent for a long moment. "Because I have to believe that most of you are like me, just ordinary men who got swept up in something monstrous. If I believe every German is personally responsible for every crime, then there's no hope for any of us moving forward." Some of us bear more responsibility than others, Weber said quietly. Probably. That's for the courts to sort out. But you, Klaus Weber from Rosenheim, who helped in the kitchens and tried to learn English and worried about his mother and sisters, I can't see you as a monster. And if I can't see that in you, then the meals we shared meant something. They meant we're still human, all of us, even after all this. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was acknowledgement of something more fundamental, the possibility of moving forward without forgetting. The camp remained operational through the autumn of 1945, though its population gradually decreased as prisoners were processed, evaluated, and eventually released or transferred. Weber was among those released in October, given papers and transportation to what remained of his hometown. He found his mother and sisters alive, living in a partially destroyed house, surviving on even more meager rations than he'd received as a prisoner. His sisters, aged 16 and 19, looked thin and exhausted. His mother had aged a decade in the war's final year. The food packages Weber received from the Red Cross, initiated by Private Atkins before Weber's release, literally kept his family alive through the first post-war winter. It was a small gesture that carried enormous weight, the continuing echo of those first shocking meals in the British camp. Years later, Weber would become a teacher like his mother, specializing in English. He would tell his students about the war, about serving in a defeated army, and about the British soldiers who chose to see hungry men rather than hated enemies. He would describe the shock of receiving that first bowl of stew, the taste of bread that seemed miraculous after months of deprivation. We were at our lowest point, he would tell his classes, defeated, starving, expecting the worst, and we were shown humanity instead. It didn't erase what had been done, but it offered a foundation for something better. The meals we received weren't just food. They were a lesson about who we could choose to be, even in the aftermath of horror. Private Atkins returned to Manchester, to his job as a civilian cook, to a Britain struggling through post-war austerity. He would sometimes think about Weber and the other prisoners, wondering if any of them survived and rebuilt their lives. He never regretted the extra portions, the small kindnesses, the choice to see individuals rather than abstractions. Dr. Reynolds' medical reports influenced post-war understanding of treating starvation and nutritional rehabilitation. His documentation of the refeeding protocol saved countless lives in subsequent humanitarian crises. Lieutenant Morrison's approach to prisoner management became a case study in military ethics education, an example of maintaining humanity under difficult circumstances. The generous meals British soldiers offered their emaciated German prisoners weren't simply acts of individual kindness. They were a statement about the kind of world the Allies hoped to build from the war's ruins, one where former enemies could become partners in reconstruction, where humanity could persist even after years of brutality, where a shared meal could become the first step toward reconciliation.